Welcome to the channel, bringing a real-world perspective to the real-world whiskey consumer.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Erin.
And we're back with another topical video. Bring them to you every Tuesday. We like to start conversations with you guys, and this is part 2 of our bourbon slang, bourbon jargon, whiskey jargon, whatever you want to, jargon you want to use to call this, whatever it is. But this is part 2. We got 10 more terms coming your way. These are going to be fun. Hopefully you enjoyed last week's video. And if you missed it, we'll put a link in the video description below so you can get caught up. But be sure to leave your comments below on what you think about some of these terms, all of these terms if you're an overachiever. But you could just pick one or two and let us know what you think. Let's go ahead and get right into it. This is like nails on a chalkboard for me.
This sounds so gross.
This sounds so gross.
I know.
What it actually means for people when they use it, what they're talking about is they're talking about the first pour out of a bottle.
And I understand why it's called a neck pour.
Of the bottle.
Because it's the neck of the bottle, but it it sounds so like...
The neck pour.
Cringy. It's like cringy.
Yeah.
So what do you call it?
The word cringy to me is cringy in and of itself.
Yeah.
But saying neck pour is cringy to me.
So what do you call it?
It's just the first pour. The fresh crack. Usually I say fresh crack. Which
that also sounds kind of dirty.
Now that I'm saying it, it doesn't. But it's a fresh crack. It's not a dirty crack. So, it could be worse, right?
It's true.
At least it's hygienic.
You have a point.
Okay. So anyways, the term the neck pour, it seems to imply that the whiskey that's in the top of the bottle is somehow categorically different from the whiskey in the rest of the bottle.
Is it not?
No, it's the same whiskey. Like if you turn the bottle,
same whiskey, but it's I guess because it's not, the rest of it's going to be exposed to air once you get rid of that. Okay.
Yes.
So
yes.
But at that time that you open it, it all probably tastes the same.
Correct.
Yeah.
There are people who, to avoid the neck pour, will turn a bottle upside down to get the neck pour to go up into the bottle and then turn it right side up.
But
that's ridiculous.
It's all the same weight. It's not going to go up.
No, I mean, as you slosh the bottle around, the whiskey moves around in the bottle.
It does, but it's not all of a sudden just going to like float up to the top because it's all the same viscosity.
This is why this doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
The first 2 ounces in a bottle of whiskey are not any different than the rest of the whiskey in the bottle at that given time.
At that time.
As whiskey is exposed to oxygen over time, as more air is in the bottle, as you drink through the bottle more, the whiskey will change. Some change for the better, some change for the worse. There's no real way to tell.
Yeah.
If you don't think air changes whiskey, then pour whiskey in a glass and just leave it sitting out somewhere in your kitchen or home for 5 months and see if the whiskey changes.
Ooh, no.
I guarantee you it will.
Not 5 months.
Air changes whiskey over time, but the neck pour is not a real thing. There is, however, the very first pour out of a freshly opened bottle is going to be different than the rest of the bottle.
Correct.
Oftentimes people say it seems very closed up, very tight, maybe a little sharp, and then as air gets to it over time, it will mellow out a little bit.
But if you were to
open up a little bit,
if you were to open that bottle and pour the quote neck pour into a glass, and then fill up all these other glasses with that same exact bottle at the same time, it would all taste the same.
Yeah. It tastes identical. Speaking of letting bottles open up, as air is exposed to a product over time, that bottle will open up. Which all that means is to say is that the oxygen will change the whiskey over time. Often people say that it makes it open up. It makes it expand in flavor. It doesn't seem quite as like
sharp, maybe.
Sharp. It's a little just more. It's more spacious, you know.
I mean, and there is some truth to that because it's all like a chemical reaction, and oxygen is a chemical.
Well, this is why when you drink wine, people decant wine. It's the same idea with whiskey. We personally, as far as letting things open up, we definitely notice a difference as whiskey changes over time, and we'll put video description links to videos where we have literally poured the first 2 ounces of a bottle of whiskey into a sample jar, and then 6 months later poured the last 2 ounces of that exact same bottle of whiskey in a new sample jar, and then we had them in a blind, double blind head-to-head where we had no clue we were even drinking the same product that came from the same bottle. And you can see how the whiskey differs or doesn't differ. It's a very interesting experiment that we ran. We've actually done 2. One on Smoke Wagon Uncut Unfiltered, one on Rare Breed. Rare Breed was halfway through the bottle. Smoke Wagon was the first and last 2 ounces of the bottle. Very insightful stuff. Air does change whiskey.
It does.
How much, though? To be determined. I've actually heard that some people don't like this word, dram.
I don't know what it means.
Yeah.
Like, I've heard it. I don't know what it means.
I usually just say a pour. You want a pour of whiskey.
Oh. Is a dram a measurement, though?
It actually is a measurement.
It sounds like a measurement term.
It is an amount of whiskey that's actually very little whiskey. Most pours, when you say a pour of whiskey, you're usually talking about a 1 or 2 ounce pour. A dram is less than that.
Oh,
so,
okay.
People will say, I think it's an English term or, from somewhere over... European.
Okay.
It gets used a little bit more often, but we've kind of adopted it. It came over from Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey.
Gotcha. Okay.
And it's something that people just like to say for one reason or another.
That's fair.
Some people like to say things because they feel fancy saying them. Some people like to wear fancy coats and fancy hats.
I mean, who doesn't like to be fancy sometimes?
I think people who say dram are pretty fancy people.
I mean, sometimes you're fancy.
I'm not I don't feel fancy, so I don't say dram.
You say fancy words, though.
I say pour or a glass of whiskey or whatever. I usually don't say a whiskey. People say, like, oh, I've had 4 whiskeys. I just be like, I had 4 glasses of whiskey.
I could go either way.
Dusty is a tricky word because it means 2 different things.
Yeah.
Dusty in the sense of a product, meaning an old bottle of whiskey. It was not produced currently.
Meaning like there's probably dust on the bottle because it's so old.
That's where it comes from. Yeah.
Okay.
Cue the David Lee Murphy Dust on the Bottle song from the 90s.
A little dust on the bottle.
But the implication is that it's something that was from a bygone era.
Okay.
And some people will say something that's out of production is a dusty. Like right now, Wild Turkey 101 comes with the little embossed turkey in the glass and the banner at the bottom. The old label, just a couple of 2 years, 2-3 years removed, had the turkey head. It was a paper label.
Yep.
Some people may call that a dusty.
Because it's no longer in production.
It's no longer in production. That's extreme. But, if you have a Wild Turkey from the 90s at this point, if you're looking something that's like 20 years old, that's kind of a dusty whiskey.
So could that be correlated to like vintage? How people talk about things being vintage?
Right.
They could also say dusty.
Right. And anytime you're talking about anything vintage, there's always this kind of neo-vintage realm. Like I'm a watch guy, and this is a fairly modern Seiko dive watch. But if this were a Seiko dive watch from like 2000, there would be a conversation to be had. Is this vintage? Is it neo-vintage? Is it,
Well, in the fashion world, there's an age limit for what's retro and then what's vintage.
Right.
Technically, I'm vintage in the fashion world.
Yeah.
Because I'm older than 30 years old.
Yes. So it's one of those things that product-wise, it means something that was produced long ago.
Yeah. Okay.
In the taste world, people will say things taste dusty. And what they mean is that it tastes like old whiskey, which is different than new whiskey. Things change over time. Spoiler alert. Grains change, water changes, climates change, wood changes. Older whiskey, the wood that they used for those barrels was older wood. It was chopped down, harvested later in that wood. The tree might have been 80 years old, whereas now they might be harvesting 60-year trees.
Younger trees.
Or something.
Yeah.
So the climate's different now. Climates change, over time. Not getting into that from a political debate or anything. Like, it just happens.
Yeah.
Like, things happen. So everything changes over time. Grains change. Processes change. The way the
soil changes that the things are grown in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So things that were distilled and produced in the 70s and 80s are different than the things that are produced in the 2020s.
Yeah.
Things change. They taste different. And when people say that a whiskey tastes dusty, what they're referring to is there's a almost literal note of dust on the taste of the whiskey in your mouth.
Interesting.
It almost has like this kind of dusty attic type of note to me.
Interesting.
So that's what they mean when they say it in regards to taste. This one's going to be pretty easy. Proofhound. What do you think it means?
Someone who's going after proof.
Someone who likes higher proof whiskey.
Higher proof and only higher proof.
Yeah. Some people call it Proofhound. Some people call it Proofstitutes. Some people call it...
What?
You're a Proofstitute.
I mean, I get that, but I've never heard that before.
You haven't? No. Okay. Well, some people say that.
Okay.
I would just say that I like higher proof. I don't really use the word Proofhound. Some people do. Yeah. Some people like it. Some people hate it. I mean, it's everything. Like,
it's slang.
People love things and people love to hate things. It's slang. That's what this whole video is about. I tend to like higher proof. People might label me as a proof hound because I will actually prefer higher proof even over lower proof stuff.
I actually would kind of say you might be slightly proof houndish.
Yeah. I just like high proof stuff.
It's fine. And
everybody's got their own preferences.
I think that term is self-explanatory when you hear it. I'd never heard of it until today, but I think I knew what it meant as soon as I heard it.
Right. But if you didn't, now you do. Speaking of high proof, hazmat. This is a term that is thrown around a lot. A lot of people know what it means, but there are people who don't know what it means. Don't feel bad.
Yeah, I have had to, without, like...
What does hazmat mean? You tell me.
Well, I don't know specifically. I think it means super duper high proof, that like it has to have some sort of sticker. But like, I've only picked up on this because I've been around conversations where people have talked about, oh, that's a hazmat. And then you're like, what? And I'm like, oh, that must mean like super high proof.
It does mean super high proof.
Context clues.
Specifically 140 or above.
Okay.
139.9 proof is not hazmat. 140 and above is hazmat.
Okay.
I don't know why that term is thrown at it. It's just the term that has stuck. What it means is that the proof is so high that you cannot take that bottle of whiskey in your packed luggage on an airplane. Because
really?
The proof
There's like a law around it?
Yes. The proof is so high that if you take it on an airplane when you're at altitude, it will literally just eject the cork. Like it will pop.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So hazmat whiskey is fairly rare. There's not a lot of it out there.
And you definitely can't fly with it. So
can't fly with it.
So
it's, for whatever reason, I mean, I guess
How do they ship it?
Ground,
by truck? By truck?
Ground. Yeah.
So we could never get American-made whiskey overseas, hazmat whiskey overseas.
Well, there's ways. You wrap it up with a whole bunch of saran wrap, like saran wrap. What do they call it?
Plastic wrap.
The plastic wrap. You strap that thing down. I've heard of people doing that and then putting zip ties around it to keep the cork in. By the way, if you have really high proof whiskey, don't leave it in your trunk on a hot day, even if it's not hazmat. If it's honestly, I don't leave any whiskey in my trunk, period. But if I did have whiskey in my trunk and it was over 110 proof, I would not leave it in my trunk on a hot day. It will bloop, pop that cork, and your car will smell like delicious bourbon, and you might get pulled over. So, anyways, hazmat whiskey is the really, really high proof, high test, 93, higher than 93 octane. This is race fuel.
Wow.
If you've taken a tour on any distillery in Kentucky or really anywhere else, you probably know what angel share is. But in case you didn't,
I didn't.
It is what evaporates from the barrel while it's aging. So you put the whiskey in the barrel.
So it's like gone up to the angels, is that what they say?
Right, yeah.
Like that's their share of the blessed whiskey.
Right. And so evaporation happens.
Yes,
and the evaporative properties of whiskey or water in a barrel happen. So basically when the barrel is really high up in the rickhouse, you get more of the water content of the whiskey that evaporates out. So the proofs tend to be higher up in rickhouses. And then if you store a barrel of whiskey lower in the rickhouses, then more of the alcohol tends to evaporate and you get a lower proof whiskey
because the heat
with the age.
It's hot. It's hotter up top.
Right. And it makes the water evaporate.
Gotcha.
So bourbon, whiskey, like you're not putting 100% alcohol in a barrel. You're putting 160, it's coming off the still at 160 proof or whatever. It's going into the barrel at 125 proof. The distillate has been proofed with water. And then as it ages in the barrel and interacts with that wood, you get evaporation. So that's the angel share. And, there's high angel share. Old Forester released some high angel share special release bottles.
That means a lot of evaporation.
A lot of evaporation.
Meaning it's probably very high proof?
Those actually weren't all that high proof, but I guess they just had a lot of evaporation.
Gotcha.
Just because something has a lot of evaporation doesn't mean it's going to be high proof. It usually is, though.
Gotcha.
So it's all just part of the process. That's what it means. What do you think honey hole means?
It sounds dirty.
Okay, so it's not.
Sounds like a bathroom problem.
Okay.
Like, you know what I mean.
A honey hole is to imply that there's a store where you can find really prized bottles of whiskey.
Would never have guessed that.
Yeah, it's like your little honey hole. Like you go to that store and you get the hookup.
When you say it like that, I get it. But when you just ask me, it just sounds disgusting.
I don't know why honey is such a big thing in the world, specifically of bourbon. People love honey finished bourbons.
I do. I like honey finished bourbons.
I'm not that big on honey finished products, but people love to say honey hole. They talk about honey holes. They talk about the stores. And oftentimes you see this when they're like, hey, I'm traveling. Any honey holes along the way?
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Honey holes don't really exist anymore. Like, there's just too much information out there. There's too many people hunting for bottles of whiskey that you're hunting for as well. you're not going to just run across a store that has some stuff sitting on a shelf. You may run across a small mom and pop store kind of off the beaten path, and you can ask them if they have something. You might get hooked up, call it a honey hole if you want. More often than not, they're going to have it for a jacked up price if they have it available. If they're not familiar with your face, they want to give those products to people that support their stores on a regular basis. At least here in our town, most of the good bottles go to regulars or they go in year-end raffles. We don't really have honey holes in Nashville, Tennessee, so you know this isn't the place to come for those. But maybe if you're off the beaten path, you can find something kind of good somewhere. Honey holes have kind of went the way of the dodo, though. Let's keep with the honey theme and talk about honey barrels. What's a honey barrel?
Well, based on what we just said.
By the way, it's not an actual barrel of honey, so.
Well, based on what we just said about a honey hole, I'm assuming it's like a very sought after barrel. Yeah. Okay. So context clues, y'all.
Yeah. If you're going through a distillery on a distillery tour, the legend is that old distillers at distilleries would go through warehouses and they would taste different barrels and they would mark some of them as honey barrels. Like they were the best of the best.
The cream of the crop.
The cream of the crop that rises to the top. And so when you're tasting these barrels and you get a honey barrel, then that singular barrel is supposed to be better than all the rest of whatever that is. So if, let's say you're at Wild Turkey and you're going through the barrels that they have earmarked for Russell's Reserve barrels, they maybe have a honey barrel that is a honey Russell's Reserve.
It's not a honey finished.
Right.
Barrel.
It's just better than the others.
Gotcha.
And then now these don't even hardly, I mean, I guess they exist, but a lot of distilleries have gotten wise to the game and they're taking these better barrels and they're just making them limited release products with a higher price tag.
Marketing.
Yeah. It's not so much, you know, the single barrel that just happens to be better anymore. Speaking of single barrels, this brings us to picks. What are picks? What's a pick? It's not an ice pick.
No, a selection.
It's a selection. It's a selection of a single barrel that a store can do, a group can do.
A person can
maybe
do.
Maybe even your favorite or second or third or whatever, where we fall
or
in the
just a channel you watch from time to time.
There you go. We do picks too. So it's a selection of a single barrel of whiskey. Oftentimes a single barrel of whiskey, although blends are becoming more common. But it means that you have tasted through a few barrels, maybe 3, 4, usually 4, sometimes 5 or more. But you've tasted through a few barrels that a distillery or distiller or blender or whoever has made available to you. And you've selected one of those to be your pick of the litter, as it were.
Pick of the litter.
So, yeah, that's all they are.
Yeah.
Stores do them. Here in Nashville, Tennessee, where we're at, store picks
a lot of store picks.
You're not getting your hands on a unicorn or a heavily allocated bottle or something like that around here. This is a store pick town. You can find really good store picks.
There are very good store picks here.
Right. But if you're somewhere that doesn't have store picks locally, which there's a lot of people out there that have that, then you can find online avenues. I mean, we do barrel picks now as of this year. And if you want to get plugged in on those, then you can check the video description below for a link to our Patreon. Shameless plug. We're not picking any whiskey that's not fantastic, but you can find other online avenues to get barrel picks as well. It just means that we've selected a barrel that we enjoy and we think you'll enjoy as well. And if you enjoy this video, then go ahead and give it a like. And if you like this style of content, go ahead and subscribe, because this is what we do over here every Tuesday. Have these little topical conversations, and don't forget to comment below on some of these terms and what you think.
Absolutely. I think that's it. That wraps it up. Be good to each other. And until next time,
cheers.
Cheers.